Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us from all around the world to the Living Deltas Hub, Delta Dialogue Series, Intergenerational Solidarity and the Climate Emergency. This is the fourth seminar of the Delta Dialogue Series, which we started last in September 2022 in our very own Living Deltas Hub annual meeting at Camp Ho, Vietnam. So we would like to welcome you all to the fourth seminar of the series. And today's discussion is drawn on the research and practice to challenge the common public and policy assumptions about older and younger people and the climate crisis. I hope you remember my face very clearly. I am Shripathi. I am currently studying in Asian Institute of Technology under Disaster Preparedness, Mitigation and Management. And I'm currently associated with Living Deltas Hub as a research scholar. So I would like to welcome everyone on board, our respected panel speakers, as well as all our participants joining from all around the world. So without much on the introduction, I'd like to introduce you all to our speakers today. We have Ms. Javeria Afzal from HelpAge International, Mr. Shripathi Hadigal from Restless Development, Ms. Ngoc-Anh Pham from Youthful Climate, and our very own Ms. Siobhan Warrington from Living Deltas Hub, who will be making the case for an intergenerational approach to advocacy and action to respond to the crisis facing different generations today and in the future. So today, our series previously, we will be having a short presentation by each of the speakers, followed by a panel discussion. And we request the participants, if you have any questions or queries, please post it in the Q&A or in the chat box, which will further be addressed by the respected speakers directed to, or will be further discussed during the panel discussion. So without further ado, let's first call up our very first speaker, Ms. Siobhan. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Neshma. So can everybody see my screen? Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to share a few slides really and talk just for about 5 minutes with the purpose of introducing today's conversation and share how it relates to research we've carried out as part of the Living Deltas Hub. Oh, it's gone to, sorry, I was at the wrong place. There's my introduction slide. Okay, so youth and older people can be viewed and represented very differently in relation to the climate crisis. Young people are frequently represented as active and potential agents for tackling the climate crisis and advocating for change, although they can also be represented as victims of this crisis and a future crisis. Whereas older people, in contrast to this activism, are considered vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis, and in some cases are also considered contributors to the crisis. But those of us working with or researching with younger and older people in different contexts know that their identities and experiences are much more nuanced than these binary assumptions of agency and vulnerability. And there's clearly a need to better understand the capacities as well as the challenges facing these different age cohorts. Within the Living Deltas Hub, we've been supporting teams of young researchers in Bangladesh and Vietnam to engage with older and younger women and men in rural Delta-based communities. Using oral history and a range of visual methods, they've been exploring people's different experiences and understandings of environmental change, the different ways that people are connected to their environments, not just in terms of their livelihoods, but also their heritage, their memories and their leisure, and also people's hopes and concerns for the future. And the research shows that older women and men are actively engaged in their natural environment, whether that's fishing, farming, or homestead gardening, and also enjoying the comfort of their rural areas, particularly as young people migrate. Many young people migrate seasonally or permanently for work in urban areas. And so it would seem critical that we involve older people in living in rural areas and any programs or policies to support rural populations adapt and respond to the climate crisis. The research also shows us plenty of examples of mutual respect between the generations in terms of specific knowledge and expertise, and also existing systems of community-based mutual aid and support that younger and older people may contribute to or benefit from. And again, those like mutual respect and support, they're both considered markers of intergenerational solidarity. And younger and older people in the research that we've carried out express many shared values and concerns relating to their natural environment. Both generations have an emotional attachment to their place. There are many sensory memories shared, many of outdoor childhood play in the natural world. But the generations also express shared concerns with some of the challenges they're facing, whether that's pollution in Vietnam or embankment breaching and salinity in Bangladesh. And some young people in both of those areas express their feelings of powerlessness when it comes to affecting positive environmental change in their communities, which is something we perhaps expect given that age-based discrimination also affects young people. However, older people too refer to a lack of power to affect change, reminding us that factors such as gender, wealth, or ethnicity may be at times more significant than age in terms of influence. And we hope in the next phase of this research to further explore the power and potential of bringing together younger and older people's experience, knowledge, ideas, and energy as we begin a programme of local and national engagement and communication of the research finding in each country. So just want to take a couple of minutes to refer to some of the current discourse and literature that relates to the conversation we're having today. So some of you may be aware we're 2 years into the UN Decade of Healthy Aging. And a paper was released around this time last year looking at some of the connections between ageing and climate change. But generally, there seems to be considerable literature on young people and climate change and much less on older people and climate change. And any academic empirical studies that we find tend to be based in the global north. But what's really important to recognise, and it's great that we have Javeria with us today from HelpAge International, is they have been publishing policy briefs on this issue for many years, including briefs around the experiences of older people in the global south in rural areas. And as we were saying, their kind of active engagement in farming and fishing. But they've also consistently highlighted older people's roles in sustainable rural development and in terms of their advocacy. And just finally, if we look at the topic of intergenerational solidarity and climate change, I found recently that there was a UN conference in 2007 on intergenerational solidarity, which brought together many experts, and there's a volume, a publication based on the papers, but it was very much focused on social and economic issues and failed to cover the issues of climate change or sustainable development. The theme of last year's International Youth Day was intergenerational solidarity for sustainable development. But there does appear to be a fairly limited discourse and literature regarding the issue of intergenerational solidarity and climate change. There was the scoping review conducted last year, which looked in detail at 20 different articles and identified these 4 key themes. But as other this publication and others do point to this lack of research from contexts in the global south. So I'm going to leave it there just in terms of introducing today's conversation and hand back to Neshma. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siobhan, for creating the base of today's main core discussion we're having. So I'd like to welcome our speaker, Ms. Javeria Afzal, the Global Climate Advisor for HelpAge International. Ms. Javeria is based in Pakistan and works with HelpAge networks around the world and is currently focused on movement building of older age people on climate change and championing their unique abilities and actions to fight the climate catastrophe. Over to you, Ms. Javeria.
Thanks, Neshma. Just let me start sharing my presentation. I hope you can all see my presentation now. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Living Deltas, and the series for inviting me to speak about intergenerational approach and climate emergency. And I think, and thank you for the kind introduction, Neshma, as well. So I'll just start my presentation. So in terms of climate change and older people, I think the premises that I'm going to talk about is that the world is both warming and changing and aging. Today, there are under 1 million people aged 65 or older, and it is projected to reach 1.5 billion by 2050. So if you look in detail into the data, so 1 in every 6 person would be older and over 65 by 2050, as compared to 1 in 11 in 2019. So you can see how the world is aging, and you have climate change also occurring at the same time. So I think it's very important that we look at these two phenomena collectively rather than in silos. Climate change will have a disproportionate impact on older people. And we all know that climate change is a global issue with additional burden on aging people. This additional burden on aging people is far more in the poorer countries as compared to the developed world. And I think when Siobhan was setting the scene, she talked about how other factors like income security or the privileges that people have could have additional burden as we respond to climate change. So it is far more for the poor older people as compared to the older people that might be living in rich countries. But nevertheless, older people do have limited mobility. We all know they are at high risk from health-related, heat-related illness, and they could have low nourishment because of poor diets as well. So in a way, older people are vulnerable. And I think that could be also one side of a picture where we think that older people are passive, and that they might not have a role to play in development themes and also on climate change issues. However, the HelpAge work in the past and currently shows that older people possess both resources and perspectives that could be utilized to fight global warming. They have a role and voice. They can practice climate action with long-lasting impact for all ages. We are seeing that how older people are involved in producing renewable energy from agriculture waste, and how they're also helping communities adapt to climate change. They have a political voice that can help in changing systems and practices. For example, making system more resilient to climate change or changing behaviors. And I think changing behaviors will become far more important as time goes, because we all know that the world is reaching its planetary boundaries, and you have to do a lot of work on the consumption patterns and practices as well. And maybe older people and younger people coming together can make a real effort on this. We also know that they have financial capacities. So for example, the older rich of this world have financial capacities, they have saving, they have money that could be utilized in favor of cleaner energies and adapting to climate change. And we know climate finance is going down because of so many risks that the world is facing. So this money can really utilize for cleaner technologies and adapting to climate change. So in a way, climate change and aging phenomena are going together that might be missed out in a lot of climate modeling, IPCC reports, or the research institutes that are looking at climate change and intersections with social dynamics. In terms of HelpAge and climate change, HelpAge aspire to have a world in which all older people can lead dignified, healthy, and secure lives. They have a mission to promote the well-being and inclusion of older men and women and reduce poverty, discrimination in later life. So this is the mission and vision of HelpAge. HelpAge has been working for the past many years for the inclusion of older men and women in development policies, and really to raise their voice in policy making, in programming, in advocacy. Within HelpAge, climate action is seen as a driver for development. So to create a society for all ages, so that everyone can live a better life and livelihoods for older people. HelpAge has a 2030 strategy, and they you themselves as a role of a supporter, convener, and thought leader. I have tried to put climate change within all these three buckets of our role as a supporter, convener, and thought leader. Under supporter, we have been designing projects and programs on climate resilience and climate mitigation, and would continue to do so through our partners, through our network members. Within HelpAge, HelpAge has 4 portfolios or areas of work. And the idea is to mainstream climate change with all the 4 portfolios, which is healthy aging, income security, humanitarian inclusion and society for all ages. And I think that's a very basic stance of HelpAge, not to have a standalone climate change projects, but rather to mainstream across all our priorities. HelpAge also has a organizational climate and environment charter. They have a commitments, and the idea is to keep on keeping the track of those commitments and implementing them. As a convener, we aspire to have a movement building of older people on climate change and to champion their unique abilities and actions to fight climate catastrophe. And this is something that we are doing programming for the past many years and will be continue to do so. But the idea is that how we start highlighting the role of older people in this climate movement, in climate justice campaign, as a way to advocate that if the world has to respond to climate change, it has to be an all of society approach rather than targeting one specific group. As a thought leader, we would like to gather evidence, which we have been doing in the past and will continue to do so in terms of intersectionality of climate change with aging population dynamics, and generate some knowledge generation around that. And we feel that this knowledge generation would help in convincing the climate organization, the research institute to start looking into this intersections of climate and aging population, which seem to be missing in a lot of climate models that I talked about in my first slide. There are also 3 websites, the links that I have given in the bottom of my slide, just to give you an idea about what we are doing in terms of climate action and older people. We will launch a manifesto, a gray and green manifesto last year at COP27, in terms of how older people's voice was missing at the COP, and we aspire to have a next year COP where we would have more interactions with older people. In terms of intergenerational approach, I just wanted to give some few examples in terms of the work that we have done so far. So HelpAge has been working for the past many years on intergenerational approach, but it was just, I think, few years back that developed a guide in partnership with actually Restless Development, which is the guide for practitioners, organizations who are using or thinking of using an intergenerational approach in their work. The guide gives you evidence and case studies from countries in terms of how different generation has come together to solve different development issues, like climate change and also other issues that could have a negative impact on older people, and how to have generations come together, coordinate and communicate with each other. I have also given the link in the slide. Please do have a look at that guide. We also did a webinar which describes the discussion in detail as well. A really successful example has been on intergenerational self-help clubs that we piloted in Vietnam years ago. It's a very successful model that has been replicated in other parts of the world as well. And I think the essence of this approach is that it's an all-of-community approach rather than focusing on one generation, on one group. And it has its successful replication by government of Vietnam and in other countries as well. I think one of the sustainability aspect of this club is that they were able to get some funding from the government as well to continue their work, which is a fantastic approach in terms of local empowerment and have an all of community or all of society approach. Something that is under progress within HelpAge is under the decade of healthy aging, where we are trying to develop a guide, a policy paper in terms of how to use intergenerational approach in long-term care, health responsive, age-responsive care, and age-friendly environment. So I think really bringing the WHO decade of healthy aging and aging and intergenerational approach together. So please watch the space for the guide that will be coming soon. in terms of challenges and opportunities, so I was thinking, what could be some of the opportunities and challenges going forward if you want to do intergenerational approach to programming, to policy or advocacy. So I put the bullet points more as challenges. The flip side would be that it will be far more opportunities for HelpAge or other organizations like us to work on intergenerational approach. So the voice of older people is absent in climate debate. There's an opportunity to bring that voice, and I think that's the message that I'm convening in this webinar as well. Let's have a partnership and coordination going on in this aspect. There is a clear ageism in the climate change framing as well. I think there is a lot of conversation about youth activists, which is very good, but they are also the old people of tomorrow as well. So maybe if the young of today and old of today could come together and start speaking the same language, there is a lot that we can achieve. The vulnerabilities, knowledge, the wisdom and capacities of older people is not integrated into climate action. Whether you talk about NDCs or the National Adaptation Plan or national mitigation plans at the national, regional and global level, you will find it that the voice of older people is missing. There is a lack of access to climate information. A lot of focus group discussion that we are having with Older People Association in our country offices says that there's a lack of climate information for older people, how we can have age appropriate literacy projects and documents or policy briefs for the older people that they start accessing the information. And maybe there is a role for youth as well in that, have a digital literacy, how we can use apps and our gadgets to start, convening the message within the generation and overcome this gap in knowledge. And the interaction could be both ways. You will be amazed to see the energy level of old people in communities and maybe maturity of youth people. So maybe that's the way, if we can switch the roles, we might be able to achieve a lot. And last and not the least, there is very less intergeneration solidarity projects on climate action, and I think there is a need to design some projects and programs. So give some practical guidelines and tools for organization and practitioners to start thinking on this important issues. I'll just stop here, but thank you so much. It was excellent to have a conversation, and look forward to the question and answer session, and to keep on having this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Javeria, for your presentation, and we'll have further discussion during our panel discussion. Now I'd like to introduce Mr. Shripathi Hadigal. Mr. Hadigal works with the leading youth NGO, Restless Development, with a focus on climate change. He's based in Bangalore, India, where he supports young people in urban areas to engage in climate action, considering the just transition needed to support the citizens deal with the future anticipated flooding and other hazards. Over to you, Mr. Hadigal. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just share the screen. Is the screen visible?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, thank you so much. I think it's been fantastic to be part of this group, and also I think really I don't think there could have been a better time for this conversation to happen, because I think we really are in a sort of critical juncture in, I think, the story of humanity, where everyone has to come together, and there's no, I think, better way than young people and people with experiences and have seen things in the sort of the older people coming together. So, and also Javeria, thank you so much for, I think, giving the context from HelpAge International, because I think having worked with HelpAge, it really sort of puts together the criticality of being working together. Just before, I think, jumping into the intergenerational aspect and how Restless Development looks at it, just I think giving a quick introduction of who we are. So for Restless Development, as you can see here, really, I think the nexus of sustainable development goals with keeping young people at the center. So how do we How do we accelerate? How do we sort of look at catalyzing young people, the energy, the power, the capacity that they bring together in terms of achieving, the sustainable development goals? And we work with them, we help them to lead, we actually learn from them in creating supporting environment so that we all sort of lead action towards SDGs. And how do we do it? We do it through 2 or 3 different approaches. And of course, the youth power sort of comes at the center, but then what we call as the power shifting approach, where we ensure that the young people who are at the sort of, they're not just being the implementation side, but also the ones who lead, the ones whose thought process are taken into the action that happens on the ground. So we do it via youth-led change. That's where young people come together and they lead change. And then also we work with a lot of the civil society organizations led by young people, local young people. That's the youth collective part, because what Restless Development believes is it's not one or two young people who could bring change, but then collectively, when they come together with sort of addressing the larger challenges, it can happen in a better way. Thirdly, the Restless experts, with all the approaches that over the decades Restless Development has developed through its programs across the different hubs. Restless Development is present in across sub-Saharan Africa as well as in India as well. So the learning that emerges from the localized context of these geographies, from climate change perspective, from education, livelihoods, and so all these aspects sort of has helped us to develop certain approaches in terms of meaningful youth engagement in all these development programs. So that's where sort of the Restless Development experts come in. And which are the impact areas? So we work on education, livelihoods, voice and democracy, gender and sexual rights, and climate justice. Now, these thematic areas are chosen based on what young people want. So through our experiences, through our sort of conversations with young people, understanding what is that area, what is that sort of bigger challenge that they want to address, they want the world to address. So these are the sort of thematic areas that have emerged through that. Now, I think jumping into the climate justice. So why have we taken it as a priority? So I think Javeria also put it very nicely that, irrespective of, I think, who you are today, we are going to face the brunt of what's happening in a larger context of climate change. But unfortunately, we must have seen, sort of what happened in COP or in the larger conversation. Younger people are being systematically excluded from conversations. So either it could be intentional or it could be probably it's the inertia of the system that's already there. So it's always, I think, it's so critical that Restless Development looks at how do we include, how do we look at the larger conversation being inclusive of climate change, so inclusive of young people. And then young people do have the capacity to represent, because being a local young person represent the context of the geography, context of the culture, context, socioeconomic aspect pretty well. And also they can champion the community voices, considering the power and the capacity of engaging with larger audience, either through digital technologies or through their sort of voices. How do we sort of leverage on that? And also obviously taking action towards the climate change nexus with with development. And thirdly, I think it's also very important that we sort of support young people, especially from the grassroots sort of context, in championing climate actions, because today the most of the sort of innovations and solutions that are happening, the most of them do emerge from the grassroots. So how do we actually empower them? Sort of how do we unlock and unleash their power to sort of coming up with those solutions? And also, I think finally, it's up to us right now in terms of what do we offer our future generations, and also what do we offer the younger generations today, so that it becomes an intergenerational responsibility, so that the policy making, the advocacies that happen, even the smaller actions that the smallest governance structures take today. So how does that actually sort of look at the justice towards the current generation and the future generations as well. So yes, I think it's to be seen everywhere. I mean, there are young people looking at what's happening today, there's anxiety around it, and then obviously, I think without young people, how do we even create policies which are going to impact them? And also not only that, but then also looking at the larger platforms, the sort of the majority campaign that Restless Development did to sort of looked at how do we ensure that the young people become part of the larger conversations as well. And yes, we are already working on it. Very briefly, just to sort of touch upon it, our programs in Zambia, in Uganda, in Bangalore, here in India, looking at climate change from different perspectives, either through research or community-led actions, or in case of Bangalore, where we are sort of looking at how can the just transition happens in an urban expansion that's happening in a lot of the cities across the world, and how do we ensure that young people from the marginalized communities are taken into considerations as well. Finally, coming into the intergenerational approach and climate emergency. So why is it so critical for us? So just before sort of getting into it, looking at how are all our approaches almost necessitate that we have an intergenerational approach, because for us development, all the young people come at the center for the development, for the conducive ecosystem for young people. Everyone has to work together. So that's how I think all of our programs have that intergenerational approach, and all our four sort of key approaches in terms of community mobilization, youth accountability, where we look at sort of bringing in and strengthening accountability in development. Thirdly, looking at young people leading the research, bringing in the voice towards understanding any of the context. Then finally, the strengthening of local civil society organizations as well. Now, across all these four approaches, we see that the intergeneration approaches become so important, and those conversations take the center stage of it, because it's so critical that whenever the community mobilization happen, as I think Ms. Javeria was also putting very nicely, that it's important that we consider the voices of people who understand the community dynamics very well, because the diversity, the sort of nuances of the communities sort of come out well through people who have been there, who have seen it, who have actually gone through these things. So especially when it comes to climate change cuts across socio-cultural boundaries. It cuts across the age boundaries. So looking at, let's say, how 15 years ago, what was the frequency of a flood? What was the frequency of the sort of the very hot summers? Now maybe the frequencies have increased, but then the effect, the sort of the way it was sort of handled through some of the traditional ways, some of the innovation that sort of emerged from the very indigenous manners, that sort of we could understand from the older people as well. Not only that, but also the community institutional knowledge. That's such rich knowledge that's been sort of evolved over the years. I think young people can leverage a lot on that by having those interactions, having those engagement with older people from socio-cultural, from geographical, and from the historical aspects as well. And it's also very important that the program design, which I think takes a very, very critical stage these days, because how do we ensure that the programs that are designed in a very systemic manner, which considers all the aspects in a right manner? It's because it's not that when the programs are designed by young people, caters to only the young people, but then how do we look at creating program designs, especially for climate change, which is so dynamic, which is so complex, by getting the sort of by including the voices of older people and people who are going to sort of face the brunt of those the results of the programs as well. So this is, I think, sort of, I'd like to stop and sort of we'll be very happy to be part of the panel in the next section as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hadigal, for the presentation. Now we will be moving on to our final speaker, who's Ms. Ngoc-Anh Pham. She is the current leader of the Youth for Climate Policy Working Group in Vietnam and a communication specialist. She's working to engage and empower younger generations to actively participate in the national decision-making process on youth and climate change. Over to you, Ms. Pham.
Thank you so much, Nashma. I'm very glad and I'm very honored to be a part of this conversation on intergenerational solidarity on climate action. And so to raise my own voice, I'd like to share a little bit about the Youth for Climate initiative, which is what my current project is a part of, so that you can all have a better understanding of the kind of perhaps like evolution of this project and how it has come to the conception of the Youth for Climate Policy Working Group. So I hope you can all see my screen. So I'm just going to brief through the conception of the initiative in Vietnam. So it really started in around December of 2020, and the Youth for Climate special report this year So youth climate action in Vietnam has already been going strong for a long while, but we really wanted everyone to come together and be able to have a more directed approach to climate action. So we gathered around 20 youth authors, and we had a 3-day workshop where we exchanged our experiences with working on youth-led projects, and we listened to each other. And we also listened to the experts on certain topics such as climate change policy, climate science, and to have a better and more grounded knowledge from the expert side. And from our discussion with each other, one of the most important bottlenecks that the youth noticed for youth climate action is the dissemination of knowledge. So very difficult topics such as climate science or climate change policy is not very accessible to youth leaders who are working on projects, because we have the will and we have the passion to approach these topics, but not necessarily always the ability to reach into the depths of these knowledge. So one of the first projects that came out of the Youth for Climate initiative is the Climate Learning Hub, where a group of youth curators worked with a panel of experts. And because as youth, we were able to be unrestrained and we're free from all of the constraints of, the conventions of government reports and serious documents and things like that. So it was a really creative project that I think really showed the advantages of youth, the strengths of the youth in understanding both the media and the youth language, and to be able to turn something that is quite difficult into something which is very friendly and consumable for youth. And for the expert side, I really enjoyed working with them as well, because they were always able to pull us back and say, oh, hey, this information is a little bit incorrect, or you have misinterpreted this, so you should look at it again. So through our collaboration with each other, both our generation with creativity and passion, and both the a little bit older generation with a lot of depth of experience, we were able to produce something which I still feel quite proud of today. So this is the website in case you want to check out. It is bilingual, and so it is in both Vietnamese and English. And we have a lot of interesting content on there. So further than that, in around June to December of 2021, we engaged youth all across Vietnam in a series of youth roundtables on 3 topics, which are nature-based solutions, creative energy transition, and climate change migration. So all of these youth roundtables were very helpful in pulling all of the voices of Vietnamese youth together in topics that they are very concerned about, and they have a lot to say about all of these topics. And in these roundtables, my reflection was that there are a lot of youth who are also very experienced and they have expert level knowledge, but from all of our conversations, it's still difficult to get the conclusions of these roundtables to the next level. That we feel that although we have been able to come together as a generation and we were able to have a conversation amongst each other, it's still difficult to push our proposals, push the things that we find are difficult with our personal climate projects to the next level, to the national policy level, and to have that really be addressed. So that was the thinking that we brought to the second special report on Youth for Climate Action in Vietnam. So that was just in August of this year. And we had another round of discussion. And this time what came out of of the second report is a very clear roadmap for youth for climate action for the next year, where we focus a lot on youth empowerment in policy processes. So this has been an ongoing process, and it's really only been 1 month since the conception of the Youth for Climate Policy Working Group. But as the leader of the group, I've had the chance to really be the bridge between both the youth and also the experts, and we've had a lot of good discussion about it. But I think that it's really important to keep the fire going and to push forward. So that's very briefly about the Youth for Climate initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pham. Now I think we'll be heading to the most important session that will be led and chaired by Siobhan, as well as to our panel speakers. So over to you, Siobhan. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Neshma, and thanks for the great presentations by our 3 guest speakers, which are really thoughtful and reflective, and I think give us a lot to think about and talk about. And yeah, I have a set of some prepared questions, but also obviously listening to people's presentations today has made me think of other things we can talk about as well. And I think one of the things I would just like to say in listening to the different talks is, I think obviously we can recognize that while we have these some of these assumptions and representations of older people as active and younger people as active and agents of change in some representations and older people as vulnerable, we're hearing from Javeria and from Shripathi and Ngoc that younger and older people can both experience a lack of power and voice, and that some of those differences in power are between ordinary people, younger and older people experience and living with the impacts of climate change and are decision makers. And perhaps, that points to the need, as I think Shripathi talked about, this being an important time to have this conversation, because now more than ever, people need to come together to increase their power and voice in relation to decision makers and being able to shape the futures that we all need. So I think what I'd like to start with, perhaps, if you could each share some of your professional and perhaps personal reflections on the opportunities and challenges of an intergenerational approach, and recognizing that those opportunities and challenges might be different, will be different in different contexts. And I wonder if we could start with Ngoc as a last speaker, if you could share some of your personal professional reflections on working on taking more of an intergenerational approach, or what that means.
Thank you for your question. So I think that usually when we talk about intergenerational approach, I think there is a feeling that there is a separation between the generations, that the youth belongs to one generation and has their own strengths and advantages, and older people belong to a separate generation, and they have their own strengths. So my reflection when I'm working on the projects that are related to the Youth for Climate initiative is that is not really true, because when we're working together like that, I noticed that there are a lot of people my age who also have a lot of good knowledge, like expert knowledge, and they're able to lead the projects. They're able to give a lot of good insight into certain research topics. So yeah.
Thanks, Ngoc. And that reminds me of something I think, Javeria, you pointed out, that, asking us to sometimes flip those assumptions and recognizing that young people can have that maturity and expertise that we sometimes like to ascribe to the older generation. As you said, we can find very energetic older people who will be ideal for kind of leading action or advocacy. So yeah, maybe you can share some of your further reflections on that broad question as well.
Yeah, yeah, I think, yeah, I was just reflecting on something which is, there is a lot of conversation about the rebellions, across, across the countries, and how they're gluing themselves to streets and to the walls, So I was just thinking, there is there are different perceptions across the regions. So in a way, the globe is not homogeneous when it comes to aging. Different regions are aging at a different pace. So for example, Asia Pacific is a fast-growing has a fast-growing aging population, and so Europe might have already entered that stage. So I was thinking, the public perception is that maybe in Europe that the young are very rebels, and they in a way might not. The policymakers, I'm assuming, may not take them very seriously, that they they disrupt their daily life of their people, and do a lot of things that doesn't fly with them. So maybe bringing the older people together in this conversation can bring that more settledness in this conversation, and start having this dialogue between youth and older people, and that might carry a lot more weight, rather than doing a lot of activism that might not fly, that might not fly with a lot of common European people. So that could be one approach. So the second I was thinking was also in terms of how would it seem like if older people are glued themselves to the roads and walls, so maybe flipping and this activism as well. So there could be different tools and techniques you can start doing that can really get this intergenerational approach for policy, for lobbying, for advocacy going on. So that's something I was reflecting. Other than that, I was thinking about more from a South Asia, South Pacific perspective, where older have a different meaning for the family members, for the community. Older people get more respect from the younger, and it is expected that the youth would respect your older and would listen to them, because they bring a lot of wisdom on the table. They have led their lives and have reached that age, so they already have that experience. So maybe a different approach would work in Asian context, so rather than a different approach in Europe, there would be a totally different approach in Asia. So maybe I think that the message is that we have to look at different levers and tools in terms of intergenerational approach when we talk within different regions, or want to do programming in different regions, rather than having a common framework that fits across for younger and older generation, and as part of an intergenerational approach. So I think that's the way I was thinking when you asked this question.
Thanks, Javeria. Thanks. And I think that was that sort of message about paying attention to context, and things need to be contextually specific, is something that Shripathi certainly drew attention to in his presentation. And I wondered whether you had any, Shripathi, whether you had any other personal reflections or professional reflections on some of these opportunities and challenges.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's, I think it's probably what I think Javeria touched upon in terms of how it's sort of, it's different in how young people looked at rebels in Europe. Maybe it's not the same here. Just, I think, want to bring a couple of examples with professional and personal experiences. I think one of the ways in which we saw the way climate change is looked at from younger people and older people, how it's more of a problem of a bigger picture for younger people, because when during the conversation with the communities, I mean, they're all the marginalized, the urban communities here in Bangalore, when we sort of had this conversation on what's happening from the climate change sort of perspective, and when we try to communicate with them in terms of how it's a larger issue, it's more of not associated with your community, but it's the problem sort of goes beyond just this community and cuts across. Now, I think the way climate change is perceived itself was quite interesting, because for the older generation, the people who have been there, these are the sort of temporary settlements, and they've been there for a few years. And for them, it was more of, oh, well, now if we start sort of opening up about our problems, we might be evicted tomorrow. So it's more of that day's problem, because they've been facing that issue over the years. They know how difficult was it. And for younger people, it probably not so much, because they were actually the older people, the parents and the grandparents did so much to give that sort of, as much as possible an easier sort of atmosphere these younger people to grow up even in those difficult circumstances. So it was easier to bring that bigger picture perspective with younger people, but with older people, it was not easy, because they knew that these conversations could lead to something which they may not sort of intend towards. Secondly, I think it is also, I think the other point would be to sort of looking at how climate change is sort of asking us to change our habits, be it in a very small way, be it in a larger way. But I think what you've seen with both, I think, personal and professional experiences is, for younger people, automatically, in many of the cases, it has become a norm. Let's say, for example, you need to change your food habits, you need to change the way you move, the way you sort of, do a lot of, everyday things. But for older people, there's a lot of inertia in them. And I think the conversation that needs to happen in a manner where I think that's where it becomes so critical that it's not only the change that you're doing, it's going to sort of change only in sort of localized context, but it actually has a bigger sort of implications. So I think the way, even with our programs here in Zambia and Uganda and in here, it was, I think I'll sort of talk about the Sierra Leonean project a little later, but I think the same messaging, but the way we sort of, communicated with younger people and older people, how do we do it, becomes so important. And also, I think, lastly, it's so important that you have both younger people and older people with you when you're having the conversation with them, because you're not just representing one sort of spectrum of, community, but then you're actually sort of representing the voices from both the places. So yes, I think it's about not looking climate change as a bigger picture and a bigger picture, plus I think looking at how it's sort of, the inertia within the mind and in our thought process, in our actions, also sometimes decide on the impactfulness of, the climate change programs between these two generations. I think that's where we need to sort of look at challenges, but also using it as an opportunity as well. So yeah.
Thank you, Shripathi. Yeah, and I guess, we also need to, as researchers or as people involved in planning activities as well, I guess we also need to check some of our own assumptions. I know it can be very, we can sometimes, we can have a tendency to romanticize some of the knowledge of older people in terms of when it comes to the natural environment, and some of that may be very valid and very useful, but as the environment, some of the environments people are living in are changing so rapidly, that may not, the relevance of some of that older knowledge may also be changing. But perhaps older people's sort of expertise lies in their past experiences of coping with change, whatever those different changes may be. Like you talked about older people experiencing the risk of speaking out on certain issues, which may affect their circumstances. And so, yeah, there's a lot to kind of recognize and understand about our own assumptions and where people's knowledge and perceptions are coming from. I want to just, before we open up to Q&A, return to Javeria's point really about thinking about the South Asian context and whether it is context specific or not, but seeing is intergenerational solidarity a form of what we might think of as existing social capital that we can draw on and build on to support, whether that's locally led adaptation efforts or whether it's advocacy to support communities most vulnerable to the climate crisis. So to also recognize that this is not something that we need to like design and do, but intergenerational solidarity does exist, and perhaps more strongly in some contexts than others. Javeria, I don't know if you want to speak to that first.
Yeah, I think it's very important about you give a reference to local level adaptation, and I think that's where in a way maybe, you know, there is already a conversation going within the communities, because you want to give the empowerment to the local communities as the custodian of their own environment, and, you know, help them adapt to climate change. But I think it's about also highlighting the role of generations as well, together, like older people and younger. I don't know if that will one of the examples I'm going to share answers to questions. For example, we are doing this biochar development project in Vietnam and Philippines. And the idea is that how the youth and the old people can come together and do this, you know, production of biochar, and in a way learn in the process as well, you know. And I think the basis of this coordination and communication and working together is that maybe the youth doesn't have that much time within themselves to do something for, you know, on trying out different things, and maybe all can drive that agenda, you know. And we already know there's a lot of out migration going on within the rural areas, you know, people are moving to cities. And I think the evidence points out that it's the youth and the young people who are, you know, migrating, and the older people generation, you know, is left out. So when you are talking about local level adaptation, I just have a feeling that we need to just start acknowledging the role and the perspective that older people bring in, you know. So in this partnership, they exchange the knowledge and everything. So maybe, you know, even though we don't want to romanticize the older people contribution and their past experience, but really acknowledging the fact that they are there, they're an important part of the community, and that they have a role, you know, they are not a passive recipients of anything, or you know, someone who doesn't have anything to play now that they have got older, but in terms of mutual respect, mutual coordination, and communication going ahead within the communities.
Thank you, Javeria. Thank you. Ngoc, Shripathi, do you want to add anything else before we perhaps move to the Q&A, Nashma, after?
Yeah, I think just a quick point. I think Ms. Javeria put it very nicely. It's also about how older people and younger people are sort of accustomed to certain way of messaging. It's more of coming from sort of personal experiences of, you know, talking to the older generation about climate change. Now, what happens is, if you look at a lot of the communications around climate change, I mean, younger people, they read blogs, they do hear podcasts, they do watch YouTube videos, they have these conversations, they have these webinars, and there are so many different ways in which the communications happen in English. Happens, you know, sort of, you know, in a level which, you know, it sort of caters to younger generation. Now, older generation, if I think of our, you know, sort of parent generation and older generation, a lot of the times what happens is the messaging, I mean, happening in vernacular language is very rare. I think, you know, even in, for example, if you take so India itself, I mean, considering 28 plus states and so many of, you know, different languages and dialects, really looking at, you know, sort of in how many vernacular languages do we actually have solid communications and messaging happening in climate change. Now, the elder generation, the older generation are sort of, you know, subscribed. I mean, if you look at the type of news or type of sort of communication that comes on their WhatsApp messages, it's mostly in a certain ways of things getting communicated, and very rarely that the sort of, you know, things that we talk about climate change, the climate justice and all those things, it never sort of appears in. So I think the contextualization needs to happen not only in terms of the socio-economic, but also looking at the culture, language, like how do we ensure that the messages are put in a manner that it won't look like, oh, these younger people are talking about something which it's not connects to us. It's something, you know, more of like whatever we say, they're saying no to it, because I've seen that's happening. Like the moment I mean, as simple as like, you know, going to like big family meets and even like, you know, in the public saying that please avoid using plastic can become a very rebellious statement, saying that, oh, I mean, when did this start suddenly now? I mean, we've been using it for so long. So it's all about, because I think it's just about keeping the communication very localized, very, you know, sort of how it caters to different people. And it's vice versa as well. And there are certain ways that I think younger people won't connect to that messaging. Maybe the older people connect, you know, to it very well. So I think it's all about how do we look at messaging, communication, and the conversations, like the webinar that's happening right now today. How do we tomorrow go to a village in India, or Pakistan, in Vietnam, have this same conversation to this extent and in this depth, can we have it in a very localized context, in sort of local language? I think the moment we do it, then I think we are really going to sort of breaking the sort of gap between the older and younger generation. So yeah.
Thank you, Shripathi. Sorry, I was muted. Javeria, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, so I was thinking, thank you, Shripathi, really good points. I was also reflecting in terms of the local context. I was thinking, if there is a community who is highly vulnerable to climate change, and there are youth and old living in this community, and they all are vulnerable to climate changes in their own ways, but they bring certain capacities on the table. Their coping mechanism and coping capacities are their own. Older people would have different coping capacity, youth would have different coping capacities. And I think the idea of local level adaptation from an intergenerational approach would also that, if certain generation has vulnerabilities, that could be compensated by other generation capacity as well. And that's where the intergenerational approach could have a lot to offer in terms of, a community resilience model, that every generation, every group has something to offer. And when you're living in a community, it has to be compensated, or vice versa, And I think that's where maybe that could be one of the indicators of local level adaptation as well, in terms of having this all of a community approach. So I think when, Shripathi was talking, I was just having those reflections. Great discussion. I'm really enjoying that.
Oh, thank you so much. Ngoc, do you want to add anything, or shall we we maybe have a couple of questions in the chat from the audience?
Yeah, I see a couple of questions there as well. Maybe we can move to the Q&A.
Okay, so Neshma,
Yes,
share one of the
I think this is a very interesting question. I think which Miss Ngoc, I think, was typing, but maybe she'll address it in person, like verbally as well. Which asks a very big thing or question about how younger generation are put in a spot to fix the climate crisis right now. Do we think these shifts burden from the older generation and places an unfair burden on the youth? So over to you, Ms. Ngoc.
Thank you. I thought this question was really interesting because the mantra in the news that the younger generation are the ones to fix the climate crisis is often framed as the youth proclaiming that it is unfair to us. But I think that it is only really unfair if the youth are not allowed to be prepared, are not helped in the preparation to face these issues themselves, are not empowered to take action. Because at the end of the day, we cannot sit at the sidelines and wait for the older generation who supposedly caused climate change to fix this issue. We also have to step in and take our own actions. And it's only unfair, I think, in this case, if we're stopped or we are prevented or we are not helped with the chance to learn more about how to take really good directed action for climate change.
Anyone else would like to address this question?
Yeah, just quick reflection. I was thinking, very interesting question, but if you put the question, I think that's the same question the developing world has been asking the developed world, that you have caused this problem, and now don't transfer this responsibility to the developing world. So in a way, I think if we stop this blame game, in a way, in terms of some of the articles of Paris Agreement, negotiations, some things would, in terms of common but differentiated responsibility, the debate would go on for some time. But in terms of our own societies, as individuals, as community members, we might have to stop this blame game and realize that we are in a climate crisis now. And we have to sit together and come up with the solution. So the solution doesn't lies with the youth of today only, or the older people of today only. It's just that we have to sit together and come up with a solution that works for everyone. I think that blame game might just have to stop. Let's keep them happening at the negotiation table where all the negotiators are. But as part of the society, as humans, we all have to sit together and start coming up with solutions.
I think, Mr. Shripathi, if you would like to add something.
I think it's covered pretty well. I think, as I was saying earlier, it all boils down to how do we break the information and communication barrier? Because now, yes, I think younger people are put that, okay, now it's sort of there's a magic bullet for climate change solution that younger people can solve. But again, if you look at really, I mean, climate change is a very it's a big term, right? But if you really break it down, it boils down to livelihoods. It boils down to agriculture. As simple as the wheat that I was growing every year, and this year suddenly didn't come. Now suddenly it's going to affect the whole family, and it all boils down to last year we had water in our borewell or in our lake. Suddenly the water is not there. It all boils down to that. So when you actually break it down to that level, I think everyone is going to be involved in it, because older people need water. Younger people need water. Everyone wants water. Everyone wants fresh air, right? So I think it's all about how do we break down that bigger words like climate. Look, it's about our everyday living and how do we work together. I think Javeria put it very nicely. I mean, instead of blame gaming, it all boils down to how do I pick up something and do underground water recharge, so that next time it rains, the water is going to go and fill the well and it's going to give water to everyone. It all boils down to that. I think it's very important that let the blame game happens, the bigger tables. But I think at the communities, if we show these examples and more of these sort of discussions happen, and if this voice actually goes to the table, and I think we would find sort of solutions, and no one puts anyone at the pedestal and say, go, this is your problem to solve. So
thank you so much to the panelists. So I think there's another question which I think Andy has raised, is addressing the structural inequalities like faced by women, the youth, children, like disabled, displaced, indigenous peoples, and the marginalized ethnic groups. We're just talking about a certain section, the older generation versus the younger generation, in a certain way. But there are other structural inequalities that are faced as well. So how can we build like a robust understanding of this climate risk and uncertainty, giving like youth a bigger voice? And how do we address this scale issue over there? If anyone would like to address it first.
I thought Javeria wanted to go because you're unmuted. So I can, yeah.
Shripathi, you go ahead. Sorry, I didn't realize I was unmuted.
No, sorry, no problem. Yeah, all right. Yeah, no, yeah, it's a great question, because today climate change is it's not the same for me or for someone else. It's purely because of the sort of the ecosystem around which we are facing climate change, right? So now it's as simple as in the city of Bangalore in India, which is called as Silicon Valley of India, and so much development is happening. But if you look at the way the floods hit Bangalore city, it was very different. I mean, I think the question sort of touches about the structural inequality. So whether are you a migrant community, are you sort of belonging to certain gender, or certain sort of disability, that so looking at, I mean, I think it's very important that as we are addressing the larger issues of climate change from policy side, from advocacy side, from these larger sort of perspectives, it's also important that on the ground we start building the ecosystems around these sort of structural inequalities. It could be as simple as tomorrow when the government takes a decision to build houses for vulnerable communities in urban places in India or in any part of South Asia. Can the government consider building with materials, resilient materials that sort of decreases the temperature during the summer? I mean, there are like innovations happening in material science, happening in sort of the sort of structural technology, so that
when you start addressing the issues from a very systemic manner, so that tomorrow when temperatures go in Ahmedabad or any other Indian city or in Pakistan to 40 or 50 degrees Celsius, because you actually address the structural inequality earlier itself, where you built houses which sort of looks at, cool roofing, and the communities that are staying over there would not have to face that brunt. So I think it's about how do you build a foundational ecosystem around the structural inequalities, as because I don't think we have the luxury today to say that, okay, you know what, we take 10 more years, we build all this foundation, and then we start addressing climate change. No, the adaptation and the mitigation they have to happen very, sort of parallelly, and especially for, communities with structural inequalities, from gender to, the sort of, especially if in India, it could be caste, and it could be religion, it could be, there are a lot of sort of inequalities that sort of come under. And then climate change is a monster, which is not going to, sort of care whether you are different religion or you're different, sort of countries. Even the country's boundaries fade away, right? So it's so important that I think we start looking at sort of building those fundamental pieces of ecosystems around, and so that we are addressing the structural inequalities before we start. I think Bangladesh has already seen, even Pakistan floods, for example. This is like brunt of climate change. If we'd had sort of, address the fundamental sort of the structural inequalities or the ecosystem factors earlier, I don't think I think we could have sort of, faced the brunt of climate change little sort of, lesser. So I might have complicated a bit, but I think that's what I think, sort of looking at that question, Andy. So yeah.
Yeah, just to I think add to what Shripathi was saying. I think one thing that increasingly we are seeing is the lack of data. So I was just thinking in terms of really challenging, or working on the structural inequalities, there is also lack of data in terms of, the excluded group members within the communities. For example, just taking an example of older people, when you look across different climate models, different, the SSP or the regular climate model, they don't take into demography or, this in terms of the data by older people or by different age brackets. So I think there is a need also to look into more granular data to make a lot of, predictions, because climate change is is so uncertain. But at the same time, I was thinking this is a very important question, and I think Andy already gives some pointer in terms of what could be done. And I was thinking some of the examples that HelpAge has been doing in countries. It was also about how to ensure that the excluded are included. For example, the disability angle, or the people with visual impairments. So there are some good examples in terms of how we can start integrating them in climate action or in preparedness measures. But I think they should be structured in a way that they start to look into climate actions as well. But I think but there is a quite a lot of lack of information or data within communities as well, and maybe something that we can all look into as we work on climate.
Thank you so much to both. I think we're towards the end of the session. So before, if anything from Ms. Ngoc, if you'd like to add before I hand the session back to Siobhan.
No, I think I don't have anything more to add from my side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Over to you, Siobhan. Thank you.
I will thank you. Obviously, it's a very rich topic for us to discuss. I think we could go on for a lot longer, but yeah, we have reached the end of the time we had allocated today. So first of all, tremendous thanks to our three guest speakers who've taken the time today and preparation for that to share their work and ideas with us. And you've really enabled us to explore this topic from a variety of perspectives and contexts. And thank you to everyone who's joined today to engage in this conversation on intergenerational solidarity and the climate emergency. And before we say goodbye, I'm just going to share a couple of other slides. Hold on a second. I just would like to invite anyone who is interested, anyone who's attending today, and also, of course, the speakers, anyone who's interested in continuing the conversation, to email me and let me know. And I would personally, I'd be keen to set up and host an informal Zoom meeting, perhaps later in February, with people who are interested to further explore this topic and perhaps to explore the potential of some further collaboration, be that around research or general learning on the topic. So yeah, please do make a note of my email address, and I think Holly will probably be in touch with everybody just in terms of a feedback form. So we'll encourage you to be in touch if you're interested in continuing the conversation. And just to highlight that the next series, next in the series of Delta Dialogues, will be on locally led adaptation and governance, which seems appropriate because that's come up quite a bit today in today's conversation. So we hope that some of you will be able to join us, and please, of course, do share the links with those in your network. So thank you once again. Thank you very much. And wishing all of you a very good rest of the day or evening, wherever you are. Thank you.